Hello and welcome to the Alpine Valley School podcast. I'm your host, Mark Gallivan. This is episode 50 of our show, which is a pretty big milestone for us, and I appreciate you joining me to celebrate. We've got a very fun special episode ahead with favorite stories from Sudbury Schools all across the nation. Thanks for tuning in. You can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalleySchool.com/podcast/EP50 for episode 50. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit more about our school. Alpine Valley School is a private K-12 school located in Denver, Colorado that follows a self-directed democratic education model, also known as the Sudbury model. On this podcast, we discuss our model of education, share stories from day-to-day life at school, and interview graduates of our program on their experiences. If you'd like to share your thoughts and opinions with the show, you can reach us at podcast@alpinevalley.school.com, or you can find Alpine Valley School on virtually all social media by searching for our name. If you'd like to come to visit, we host open houses several times a year, which you can learn more about on our website. Here's today's episode. Well, here we are in the 50th episode of our show. We've had a wonderful run so far, and I am deeply appreciative of all our regular listeners who tune in each week to hear more stories of real learning for real life, as I always say. To celebrate the 50th episode of our show, I put out a call to all the Sudbury schools around the world for favorite stories from their schools, and they really delivered. So let's get into these wonderful stories. We'll begin with a story from the Circle School in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is also an excerpt from co-founder Jim Rietmolder's book, When Kids Rule the School. You can find out more about the book by visiting the show notes page for this episode. The story was recorded at a recent talk Jim gave at the Clearview Sudbury School in Austin, Texas. Here it is.
I want to read you a story about a case in which the defendant pled not guilty and went to trial. This story is about what I call Swiss cheese thinking, because it's got some holes in it. In the book, it's embedded in a chapter about critical thinking, and it's about a student who's in stages of developing critical thinking. So Mickey was new to the Circle School. In his old school, this 13-year-old made mischief, lots of mischief, and he was well accustomed to the summary judgment of the principal. No due process there. Mickey thought he and authority were natural enemies, so he was very pleased to learn during his admissions visit that the Circle School has no principal, head of school, or anything like that. I told him he has as much authority in this school as anyone else, including the adults. But of course, he had no context for understanding what that meant. Mickey was also pleased to learn that when he got in trouble, as he assumed he would, he could argue his own defense before the judicial committee, composed of 4 students and 1 staff member. If, despite his best arguments, they charged him with breaking a rule anyway, he could plead not guilty and then, within 4 school days, argue his defense before a jury. This got his attention. Mickey smiled and decided to enroll. His first opportunity came up very early on. He ate an Oreo cookie in the library, violating a rule about where it's okay to eat and where it's not. Called to the JC, he readily admitted eating the cookie and also agreed with witnesses who said they had told him not to eat the cookie in the library, but he did so anyway. He and the JC discussed why the rule forbids food and eating in the library, having to do with messes, ants, and mice. After that, Mickey said, he had actually put the entire cookie in his mouth, so there was no possibility of crumbs, and he shouldn't be charged with breaking the rule. Good thinking, I suppose, but not persuasive, and maybe not honest. The JC charged Mickey with breaking the rule. As is common with new students, they gave him a warning instead of sentencing him, and then asked for his plea. Not guilty, said Mickey. And so the case went to trial with stakes of principle and pride, but not punishment. Mickey worked hard on his defense for the next couple of days, including significant research. In a packed courtroom, addressing the 6 jurors, 5 students, and 1 staff member, he laid out his case. Now listen carefully to follow this. Food, he said, is an edible substance with nutritional value, and he read a dictionary definition to back him up. Then he called attention to the nutritional label on the Oreo package. There is some nutritional value in an Oreo cookie, he said, but not much. However, by his calculation, if a person ate less than half a cookie, they would ingest less than 1% of the government-recommended daily value of every nutrient on the label. Furthermore, under federal rules, percentages less than 1% are shown as 0%. Got that? With a charming grin, Mickey then testified that he had taken only 1 bite of the cookie, amounting to less than 1/3 of the cookie. That meant he had consumed less than 1% of the daily value of every nutrient, which translates to 0%. Thus, having no nutritional value, it wasn't food after all, and he had not violated the rules. The defense rested its case. The jury was, shall we say, confused. In our system, jurors have an opportunity to question witnesses. My favorite moment in Mickey's trial was when the youngest juror, 5-year-old Leo, penetrated the fog and went right to the heart of the matter with his incredulous question for Mickey. "You ate a cookie in the library?" The prosecution neglected to note the discrepancy in Mickey's testimony. To the JC, he testified he ate the whole cookie. In trial, he testified he ate only a small bite. It didn't matter. The jury took only a few minutes to find Mickey guilty. As Leo's question aptly highlighted, the case was as black and white as an Oreo cookie.
And here's another fun story from sun-soaked, or maybe just plain-soaked, Miami, Florida.
This is Kristen Parker Yarnell from the Miami Sudbury School, and I'd like to share about our fish tank fiasco this year. It's a wonderful scene featuring a 30-gallon tank that had 1 little tiny betta fish. We had a nature corporation at school that was taking care of the fish, and they had brought the tank outside to clean it and decorate it inside, and then filled it with water, filled it with fresh water, brought it in, and they were bringing it in, and it was very interesting to watch the coordination and communication issues that ended up with the tank being roughly put onto a stool while one of the members decided they weren't going to participate. And then all of a sudden, as we all watched, the tank started to leak water and then gush water. So all of us in the school are watching this tank empty itself of water. And while there was at first a stunned silence, instantly then there became yelling and finger pointing. Instantly, the president of the Nature Corporation abdicated his leadership position. It was chaos. Meanwhile, staff had to say, hello, there is water and a fish happening. This is in the living room of our school. And folks did spring into action. The fish was somehow scooped up into someone's hands and put into a cup with water. And the rest of that morning was spent sweeping up glass and sweeping water out of our second-story studio space. But what was really interesting about that was the processing afterward. So After everything was cleaned up, there were initially cleaned up. There were days of leftover fish cleanup of little rocks here or some supplies, what to do with the destroyed fish tank. And it led to some really fascinating JC cases of who was ultimately responsible, even if they had decided to abdicate responsibility. So personal and corporate responsibility. The corporation ultimately dissolved and the fish was relocated, but the people involved were held accountable. And we had a whole school debriefing and discussion centered around better crisis management. So talked about why the yelling and finger pointing at that moment weren't very productive and what we wanted to do as a school next time. This fish fiasco is now immortalized in our school history as both a classic catastrophe and a catalyst for growth and culture building. Thanks.
This story was sent in via email from Maggie B. at the Three Rivers Village School in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I was sitting at my desk early on this school year doing some kind of busy work at my computer. Strolling up to me came Omri, a new student, 5 years of age. He started talking to me mid-thought, his inner dialogue now coming out as words for me to hear. He said, "I miss my cat and my dog." He went on to tell me their names. I listened and waited for a turn to share my pet's name. I said, "I have a cat named Ginger." He stared at me incredulously, with big brown eyes, scrunched up his nose, whipped his head back and forth, looking around the room. He practically shouted, "Where?" A feeling of joy washed over me, and I smiled and said, "At my house." His look of disbelief turned into confusion. This kid can twist his face up and around in the most marvelous ways. He stood next to my desk and said, "Your house?" in a firm, inquisitive voice. Immediately, I imagined that to Omri, I was purely integrated into his life at school. My whole life existed there from his perspective. It made me think about how the worldview of a young child is holistic, and as they grow and have experiences and conversations like the one we had just had, that holistic view slowly breaks apart into pieces, sometimes like magic, sometimes in devastation. I felt like I had magically been plucked from Three Rivers Village School and moved into a new realm in Omri's head where I had a cat and a home. Being able to converse with kids and share school life with each other, to me, is magic, occasional devastation, and many things in between. And our last story comes from Salt Lake City, Utah.
Hi, this is Jen with Sago Lily School in Salt Lake City, Utah in the USA. We have been open since 2004, so trying to think of a favorite story is literally impossible at this point. But one of my favorite things we've done at our school that's spanned over the last 8 years, really, is we participate in a worldwide problem-solving competition called Odyssey of the Mind. And we've done this almost every year. We took 1 year off in the last 8 years. But every year we have 1 or 2 teams of 7 students, and we spend our school year, part of our school year, working on what's called a long-term problem. And then we go to a state competition where we get to present our problem solution and also perform in what's called spontaneous problem solving. And what's been amazing every year, so first of all, we tend to have one of the few high school teams in the state, so we almost always win. And that, of course, is fun for us, but we've been state champions for 7 out of the last 8 years because we are one of the few teams in our categories. But the other thing that's really fun about it is we also get to go to world finals, and we've done that most years as well. And so one of my favorite things has been traveling with these teams and students. And, in a lot of places, Odyssey of the Mind is a highly competitive competition. where kids, they go to a regional event and then maybe a district event even, and then a regional, and then a countywide event, and then a state event. And by the time they get to World Finals, they're just these amazing, incredible teams who have just so much practice behind them. And our teams are sort of like the little team that could. And it's so indicative of how our school is. We don't push the kids to compete. We don't push them to be the best. And yet they do these miraculous, wonderful things. And every time that we've gone to World Finals, the thing we're proud of is that we've never finished in last place. We've always come in. The worst we did was third to last. And so we like to call ourselves also the best of the worst. No, the worst of the best. And it's really fun to continue to do that, getting to travel with these children and getting to give them these opportunities to just use the creativity that they naturally have and express it in these amazing different ways. And then getting to take them to places that they've never been and see people from all over the world and connect with other students and connect with other coaches from all around the world has really been an amazing opportunity for all of us. We're doing it again this year in 2020, and we're excited to see how it goes. And that's just been one of my favorite things to get to do with our students over the years.
I'd like to end today's episode by sharing my own favorite story. Like others, I've been associated with my school, Alpine Valley, for many years, and so it's hard to pin down my favorite story, either from my days as a student here or from my current tenure as a staff member. But I'm going to pick one that sums it all up rather nicely. Back when I was a student at Alpine Valley School, I and some of my fellow students went off campus to a local store, and some of the younger students went with us. We did our shopping, and we were standing in line at the checkout counter to pay for our goods, and one of the smaller children was standing in front of me, and the clerk engaged with him and said, "How you doing? What grade are you in?" And the student, really, whose name was Mike, handled this really well and was very polite and answered all the questions, and I think guessed at what grade he was in. And we kind of got to the end of the conversation, and the clerk said to Mike, "Do you do well in school?" And because this was a fairly stupid question, Mike just ignored him. And so he said it again. He said, "Son, do you do well in school?" At which point Mike looked at him right in the eye and replied, "I do well in life." That does it for today's episode. If you have an idea for a future episode, a question, or a comment, drop us a line at podcast@alpinevalley.school.com or reach out to us on social media. You can find show notes for this episode at alpinevalley.school.com/podcast/EP50 for episode 50. I'm Mark Gallivan. This is the Alpine Valley School podcast, and we'll be back again soon with more stories of real learning for real life.
Bye.